So you want to get that blurry background, which is commonly referred to as bokeh. Not like this, more like this. Let's talk about bokeh. So a quick note, everything I'm going to talk about today can be applied to both photo and video. I do mostly video stuff, but this can be applied to photography too. When we're talking about bokeh, it's the same principle. So what is bokeh? Well, essentially bokeh is everything in the background that is kind of out of focus. As you can see here, I'm nicely set up in the foreground, I'm nicely lit. The background is out of focus. That is what we refer to as bokeh. Sometimes, more in photography than anything else, you might get some stuff that is background focused and foreground not focused, so your bokeh would be in the foreground, but more often than not, it's the background. You might hear people talk about depth of field. The shorter the depth of field or the narrower the depth of field, the better the bokeh. So why do you want bokeh? It separates the foreground from the background. It kind of makes it pop a little bit. Background is out of focus, takes your attention away from that and brings your attention to the foreground area. In general as well, if you show someone an image that has nice bokeh or a nice out of focus background, they're gonna think, oh, that's a nice image. That was done by a professional or something along those lines. Nearly every time I show someone a picture that has something with the background's out of focus, they just think it's a nice looking image. So how do you get bokeh? Well, there's a few different ways. The easiest way is by setting your camera's aperture to the lowest setting, the lowest f-stop you might hear it referred to as. To adjust your aperture so it's a wider aperture. What that means is more light is going to come into the camera. There's a shallower depth of field, meaning the foreground's going to be focused and the background's not going to be focused. The lower aperture you can get, the better. You'll see it printed on the lens what your aperture is. So this lens is a 70 to 200 mil, and you can see it says there that that's a 4. It means its lowest aperture it will go to is an f4. On this lens, which is an 85 mil Sony, you can see just there, it goes down to an f1.8. This is going to give you better bokeh than this. Lower aperture is going to be better. You're going to get that nicer depth of field, that nicer bokeh in the background. Just remember, when you want to go to something like an f1.4, it's going to let a lot more light into the lens, so your image might be completely overexposed, so you've got to do something else to kind of compensate from that. The easiest way is to adjust your shutter speed. So a real basic image setup here, just of my barbecue, really no bokeh in the background, ISO is set to 400. Reason for not much bokeh is the aperture is set at f13. So if we want to change the aperture, and we're going to bring it down here, we're going to bring it all the way down to an f4. So we'll turn it down, and as you can see, the image is now really overexposed. So the only way to counter that is to bring up the shutter speed. Bring that all the way up, get our exposure back on point. And now you can see that the exposure is set properly and we have much nicer bokeh in the background because the aperture is now f4 instead. Now when we're talking about video, there's certain rules that you may or may not want to follow, which can affect the frame rate and how smooth the image looks. But if you're just looking to get a darker image quickly and easily, adjust that shutter speed, make it higher, and that's gonna darken the image and you're gonna be able to shoot at that lower f-stop. The other way is to use something called an ND filter, like an ND4, ND8, 16, you can get a variable one. What they are basically sunglasses for your camera lens. You put it on the front and it makes everything darker. It stops as much light coming in, so when you do go down to something like an f1.8, it's letting more lens into the camera, but blocking some of that light coming in with the ND filter. Sunglasses for your camera lens. So an f1.4, which I'm shooting with on this lens here, is going to give you a really good depth of field. You can see on the Sony kit lens there that it actually goes down to 3.5 to a 5.6. That's a variable aperture. The lowest aperture this will go to is a 3.5. At 3.5, you're going to get a little bit of bokeh, but not as much as you would on something like an f1.4 or an f1.8. At the beginning of this video, I had my aperture set to f11. You saw the background was nearly in focus, so not really much bokeh at all at an f11. And then f22, which is even higher, great for landscape shots. You get a lot of depth of field. Everything from the foreground to the background is all completely in focus, but you don't have that bokeh and that background blur. Another way that you can get better bokeh is to stand closer to the lens. Get your subject or whatever you're shooting to be further away from your background. So as an example, I'm going to use my phone. If my phone is really close to the camera and I'm a little bit further away, you can see the blur is pretty good, but if I put it even closer, you can see the blur is even better there. If I bring it closer to my face, the blur's not quite all there. So you can see how having it further and further away or closer and closer, it actually changes your Depth of field, it changes your bokeh in the background. So the closer we bring it, you can see I'm getting more and more blurry there. So that's a really easy way to do it as well. A great starter lens for a lot of people, one of the first lenses that they can afford and a lens that actually gives really good bokeh is a 50mm. Canon, Nikon, Sony, they all produce a lens which is commonly referred to as a Nifty 50, a 50mm lens. Most of those go down to an f1.8. Most of those as well cost less than like $200. One other thing I want to talk about with you quickly is that a lot of phones do have modes built in now that will create the same effect or similar effect. So for example, on an iPhone, it's called the portrait mode. That mode will allow you to take images that blur the background for you, but it's not always 100%. It's software based, so sometimes it chops off your ear or something like that. On the iPhone, it's not great. Now, I also have a Pixel XL2, which does actually produce very nice portrait images. Again, it's all software based, but it does way better job on this. So here's an image with the Pixel, so you can kind of see how well it does it. For the fact that that's software, it's actually very impressive. No way to do it with video yet, but for photos, it can work okay in phones. So there we go, a quick lesson on bokeh. What is bokeh, how to get it, some tips and tricks, why you'd want to use it. I hope I managed to teach you something today. If you like this video, hit that like button down below and subscribe to my channel if you'd be so kind. Help me grow this channel, help me to help you guys, and I'll see you in my next video.